delighted to welcome you to this panel that is obviously quite timely and very important to us as a broader community, but certainly to us at the university. I would like to thank the Haas Center and the Law School's Human Rights Center for co-sponsoring this event with us. And I'd like to acknowledge the work of T.T. Liu of the Levin Center for organizing the entire panel. Yes, please. I am more than honored to introduce and to welcome back to campus Ted Koppel, who we are just so honored to have joined us this afternoon, but more than that, honored to have as a member of our Stanford community again. Just a few days ago, he received his master's degree here, so welcome back to As you know, Mr. Koppel is one of the most respected journalists in the history of our country. He was a reliable friend and news source for over 2 decades as the host of Nightline, which for many of us was a must-see every night for reliable news. And we're just delighted that he has agreed to moderate this important panel.
Thank you. Dean Chen clearly deals in relativity when she says that I got my master's degree a short time ago. It was 57 years ago. We're here this afternoon to talk about what is arguably one of the most contentious issues before us as a nation. And we have a very distinguished panel, whom I will be introducing in just a moment. I'm going to behave myself briefly by reading the introductory remarks that have been written for me, and after that, it's Katie bar the door. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, the number of hate groups has doubled over the past 2 decades. There is a new generation of white nationalist groups being run by millennials, and there is an increased presence of these groups on college campuses. The United States is almost alone among Western liberal democracies in not punishing what is called hate speech, oral or written messages that incite hatred against a person or group on the basis of their race, religion, sex, ethnicity, or sexual orientation. This panel will examine how we as a society should seek to strike a balance protecting free speech and protecting vulnerable groups from dangerous bigotry, especially against the backdrop of rising white nationalism. I have already told our panelists it's now 10 of, so you got clocks up there and up there. Each of our panelists has 5 minutes for some opening remarks. Then I'll ask a couple of questions, and then we'll turn it over to you. We have microphones here and there. Anywhere else? That's it. I began by saying this is arguably one of the most contentious issues before us. We are going to resolve it in less than an hour. And we're going to begin with Maina Kiai, Executive Director, Inform Action, former UN Special Rapporteur on the rights to freedom, on peaceful assembly, and of association. I'll introduce each person separately, and the reason that we're beginning with Maina is to give you a sense that in this particular respect, the United States stands pretty much alone in the world with regard to its approach to freedom of speech. And Maina, perhaps you would give us a sense of how and why we stand alone and how well other systems work.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. I'll just be very brief because I think the most important part of this session is hearing your views and the debates that are going on here at Stanford, among other things. But let me just start off by saying, first of all, that you can be a democracy and regulate hate speech. I know quite a few people in this country believe that the First Amendment is the mother of all rights. But if you look at it from the perspective of international human rights law, human rights are interconnected, they're indivisible, and they're inalienable. There's no hierarchy of rights that says one is more important than the other. So, and in fact, the U.S. is probably the only country in the world, in the Western world, that does not regulate hate speech. It is regulated everywhere else in the world. The European Court of Human Rights has taken a very strong stand, and I just want to read a quote that comes out from a case from 2006, which says that as a matter of principle, it may be considered necessary in certain democratic societies to sanction or even prevent all forms of expression which spread, incite, promote, or justify hatred based on intolerance. And that's the biggest thing around international human rights law, that if there's speech or there's words that promote intolerance and go against the values of human rights, basically speaking, then there is a role and a situation where there can be restrictions. But again, under international human rights law, there are three things that you have to do. One is that it must meet the issue of proportionality, and it must be legitimate, and it must be necessary for a democratic society. So right across the world, there are restrictions on hate speech, that people cannot make comments that are abusive or full of hate against other people in societies. And it's not just, incidentally, that's the weaker groups that suffer. In fact, across, again, Europe and across many parts of Africa, you'll find that there are restrictions against Islamophobia. There are restrictions against hate speech against Jewish people. There's restrictions against people of color. You're not allowed to make them against people who are LGBTIQ as a group in general. So the idea is to promote tolerance, and I think that's the key thing around society and international human rights law, is how do we promote tolerance. So it is fascinating for me, having spent a little bit of time in the US, how everything is around First Amendment, and that anything can go as long as you don't incite violence. But inciting hatred is in fact, in a sense, moving a little bit towards violence and other things in that context. So I just want to put that perspective out to you, that it's about tolerance, and it's about how do you then get a community in society that respects each other, and that things that hurt people or lead to hatred are regulated in some space in the public sphere. Of course, we can't regulate what happens in people's homes and in private, but what comes out in public is a different thing altogether. So I just want to let you know that the U.S. is an outlier on this issue around hate speech and around other things. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Our next panelist, Professor Kenneth Mack, is inaugural Lawrence D. Beale Professor of Law and Affiliate Professor of History at Harvard University. Kenneth?
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to just sort of make two quick points. One, actually, just building off of what was just said. United States is an outlier in its approach to free speech doctrine. But for the first 100+ years of American history, modern free speech doctrine did not exist. It was all invented, starting about 100 years ago. During World War I. So, of course, in the first 100 years of American history, we didn't think so much about hate speech, but American free speech doctrine is not something that comes from the original intent of the framers of the First Amendment. It is something that did not even exist for the first 100 years of our existence as a country. We didn't have anything like it. And we were still a democracy. But it did get invented. It does exist, and I am someone who does think that traditions are worthy of respect, and I think that our modern free speech jurisprudence is worthy of respect, but it is not etched in stone, and it is an invention. Second thing I'd like to say is I've been asked to talk a little bit about critical race theory and its approach to free speech and hate speech controversies. I teach a class called Critical Race Theory. I'm not a critical race theorist, but let me explain the idea. Critical race theorists have done sort of two things with regard to hate speech. First, they've claimed that speech regulation is not neutral, that the kinds of speech that harm racial minorities is more likely to be permitted than other kinds of speech that harms other groups in society. That free speech doctrine presents itself as neutral, but in fact it's not neutral. It works to the advantage of certain groups in society and to the disadvantage of others. Second thing critical race theory has said about free speech is that hate speech, to be more particular, is that hate speech causes tangible harm to certain groups in society. We are here. We are all aware of the events that happened in Charlottesville. We're all aware of recent events, and critical race theory has said that, in fact, to license hate speech is to license tangible, documentable harms that are visited upon certain groups or are not visited upon groups neutrally. So 2 propositions. One is that our modern free speech doctrine is an invention. I think an invention that's worthy of respect, but an invention. And second, there have been people who have been critical of that doctrine and have claimed that it doesn't operate neutrally and that it licenses tangible harms. I think I'll leave it there, and I'll have more to say on it probably in the Q&A.
I must say I'm absolutely astonished. We have remained on time. Christine, it puts enormous burden upon you. Christine Sun is Associate Director and Legal and Policy Director of the ACLU of Northern California.
So I work at the ACLU, and the ACLU is famously or perhaps infamously known for representing the Nazis in Skokie, Illinois, and also the white nationalists, white supremacists in the Charlottesville March. And we do that work not because we agree with that speech. We certainly don't. We denounce that speech in our communications and also in the work that we do. But that we believe it's important to not allow the government to decide what speech is prohibited and what's allowed. And as Professor Mack noted, free speech doctrine is invented, but has become more protective of speech over the last few decades. And I would argue that that's a good thing. There certainly is tension between protecting speech rights and equal protection, but they're often 2 sides of the same coin. So we're in the law school, so I'm going to talk about cases. So the Brandenburg Standard, which is the standard today, that was established in the 60s, which is that the government can't prohibit speech unless it incites imminent lawless action. That's one of the categories of speech that can be prohibited. It's a very tough line. It's a very protective test for speech rights. And that case involved speech by a KKK member that the government wanted to convict for inciting violence. The Supreme Court has not applied Brandenburg that often, but when it has done so to protect the rights of folks who are dissenters of the government or folks who are protesting racial discrimination. So one of the few cases to apply Brandenburg was NAACP versus Claiborne Hardware, where the government wanted to convict protesters of racist businesses. And the speech that one of the protesters had said was, if we catch any of you in going to any of them racist stores, we're going to break your goddamn neck. And that was speech that the government wanted to convict a protester for. And so I think, using Brandenburg or applying Brandenburg, the court held that type of speech is protected. And as a litigator for the ACLU and also for Southern Poverty Law Center that did a lot of work in the Deep South on behalf of LGBT people and youth who wanted to assert their speech rights, those cases, Brandenburg, its progeny, those cases were essential to protecting their rights. And so we might be sitting here in Palo Alto thinking, okay, I trust the government here, I trust the state of California to make the right decision about what speech is hate speech or not hate speech, or prohibited or not, or incites violence. But Would we trust the small towns in Alabama or Mississippi to make those same decisions? I don't think so. And those are the folks, I would argue, are the most vulnerable. And so I think as advocates and people that care deeply about our democracy and about minorities and equal protection, it's not so simple to say, well, speech harms minorities. It can, and it has tangible harms, but I would argue that the way to address those tangible harms is not to give the government the power to decide what speech is prohibited or not.
Terrific. Let's narrow the focus just a little bit. Let's bring it down to the campus level. University campuses are traditionally places of learning, and implicit in that is that young minds be exposed to ideas that they have never heard before, sometimes even unpopular ideas, sometimes even offensive ideas. I'd like each of you just to comment briefly on the conflict between, or at least the tension between, the importance of having a university where ideas can be freely exchanged without fear of repression of any kind, and having a university be a place that can be safe for everyone who studies or works there. Kenneth, you want to start us off?
Sure. You say that universities are places for learning where people are supposed to be exposed to ideas that they haven't heard or perhaps regard as offensive. So let me give you a little bit of the argument for, to make it more concrete. We've had controversies about safe spaces on campus, about offensive speakers being invited to campus, and those who think that the university should do something more actively in those areas start from the proposition that universities are places for learning. And so if you're going to learn, you got to have some rules so that everybody can learn. If the metaphor is a marketplace, or perhaps a marketplace of ideas, every marketplace has rules. The first year of law school is always about learning about the rules that regulate contracts, property, torts. There are certain contracts you don't get to do anything in contract. There's lots of things you don't get to do. Same thing with property rights. Same thing with all the common law rights. So I think people who want to have universities be more active in regulating hate speech on campus start from the proposition that universities are places of learning, and to have people actively learn, we have to have rules. And that maybe some of the rules that we ought to consider are rules that regulate who can say what on campus. That's not my position, but I will say that people who argue for that position do have a coherent and understandable set of arguments that do make sense on their own terms.
All right, top it off by giving us your own position.
My own position is that we ought to be thinking about more than just regulating. Offensive speech might occur on campus. Offensive speakers might be invited to campus. The range of, and I acknowledge that these are the kinds of things that could impede learning. But we ought to be actually thinking about a range of responses to this as a problem that is larger than just a simple bureaucratic solution of regulating speech and preventing maybe regulating who can be invited and what they can speak about. And just to be more specific, in my own university, we had this big controversy about 2 years ago about posters, and some posters were being posted that certain students found offensive, and certain students wanted to take down the posters. And my own university's position was that, no, we didn't get to sort of take down posters and decide which posters are going to be posted, but the students who found the posters offensive came up with another solution. They put up their own posters, and they put up a lot of them all over campus. There's lots of ways that we could think of responding to the problem of hate speech and its effect on learning. And we need to be thinking about more than just the bureaucratic solution of a direct regulation of who can say what on campus.
Maina, you said in your remarks that the United States is an outlier with respect to the First Amendment and the rigidity with which we try to enforce it. You're going to be an outlier in one of two different directions. We have traditionally liked to view ourselves as a nation, and our Constitution and its amendments in particular, as an outlier in terms of being an example to the rest of the world. I had the impression that you weren't using it in that context.
No, I wasn't. Certainly wasn't. But I think for many of us who are not Americans, we are guided mostly by international law. And international law has indeed got a higher standard generally than American law or any other laws that you find in countries. So it's aspirational in terms of where it's at, but also is law in the sense that it is not just aspirations. The law is part of what countries have come through. But I think coming to the question about, and I'm all for what Kenneth said about different forms of resistance, if you wish, to some of the offensive things that happen. But I think that, and I'm a big promoter of protests and counter protests as much as possible. I think if people can find different ways of reacting or dealing with some of the offensive things that happen, and the larger the protest and the message is heard at a larger level. But I think that also as a person who sees, I mean, I wonder how I would feel if I'm in a college or in a campus and there's all these attacks on me because I'm African, and they keep hammering me wherever I come, and people come and speak and insult me, and it makes my learning difficult within that context. And I think that in as much as we want to have, and I think we should encourage as many views as possible, but how much do we allow that then takes away from others' learning? So that safe space, I think, is an important part, and I think that's the balance we have to keep to work on. Because it's one thing to, especially if you're a minority and you're in a smaller group and you're being hammered and hammered and hammered at all places. At what point do you feel then I'm not learning anymore? And how much resilience do you want people to have before you can say this is not right and shouldn't be there? So this is a number of things there.
Before I pose a question to Christine, I'd like to ask you to begin lining up at the microphones, because we're going to start taking your questions, or comments for that matter. Christine, if someone here were to observe, Koppel, you're short, you're ugly, and your hair is weird, I would consider that hate speech. They might consider it accurate reporting. How do we draw the distinction?
Right. I mean, I think that's the really tricky part about determining what's hate speech. So, I mean, we have free speech rights, we have due process rights. You don't get to punish hate speech after the fact. There needs to be fair notice of what would constitute hate speech if you're going to prohibit it. And I think what folks have found is that it's really difficult to draft a hate speech code that's not vague, that's not overbroad, and that wouldn't punish speech that folks would agree is valuable to the learning environment. So for example, Stanford used to have a student conduct code before it was struck down by a court that was written by a constitutional law professor, so he knew what he was doing. And so it prohibited discriminatory harassment, including personal vilification of students on the basis of their sex, race, color, handicap, religion, sexual orientation, or national and ethnic origin. And so I would just posit, we might all agree, oh yeah, I know exactly what type of speech is prohibited under that code, but let me just throw out some examples, and I'd be curious if folks would think that these statements fall within that, or arguably fall within that definition of hate speech. So for example, Christianity's views of homosexuality are immoral. Zionism is racist. Men need to be held accountable for sexual harassment. Heteronormativity is oppressive. All white people perpetuate white supremacy. Donald Trump supporters are white trash. I mean, I could go on and on with statements where I, as a lawyer, could argue, well, that fits within that definition of hate speech. And so even if you're not, even if you're not ultimately found to have violated that speech code, you might be chilled in expressing those views because you're worried that you would be under investigation or have to go through a disciplinary proceeding for saying those things. So I think that's the really tricky part about regulating hate speech. There's no common definition of hate speech, right? There are a lot of different views about what hate speech is. But just going back to Maina's point, I mean, there certainly is a point at which hate speech and speech becomes harassment. Courts have found in the workplace, in the educational environment, at a certain point, speech can be prohibited or punished when it crosses the line to harassment. And from the ACLU's perspective and under Title IX and Title VII law, speech that is that constitutes harassment that's severe and or pervasive, that can be prohibited. So I think it's important that we not conflate the two.
All right, let's begin going to questions from the audience. And as I say, don't feel yourselves limited to questions. If you want to get into an argument with us, by all means do. Barely.
There's a switch.
I don't think it's your fault.
Someone's going to help you.
Okay, my question is, given that the United States is an outlier in our feelings about hate speech, why do we think that is? I know you said it's been around for 100 years, there's precedent, but what about our culture do you think has created it? And if you want to, you could also maybe address, though you don't have to, how that culture would then embrace doing things differently. Am I supposed to say who it goes to?
Oh, I'll pick. Ken.
I don't have an answer to the question of why. I mean, some people would say that the United States has a distinct culture from other parts of the world. We're more protective of free expression, but the law was different. I mean, their modern free speech doctrine simply did not exist before 1917, and large parts of it were invented in my lifetime. When I was born in 1964, things that we think of as core parts of modern speech doctrine did not yet exist. Some of them are very recent inventions. I don't ascribe to the proposition that Americans are somehow more protective of free speech culturally than others. We may be now because of the developments of the last 100 years, but there's nothing in the kind of core historical American identity that makes us so. I think modern free speech doctrine happened for a very contingent set of reasons. A lot of it had to do with repression of political radicals during World War I. That's where it all began. A lot of it had to do with repression of minority groups of various kinds, religious primarily. A lot of it was invented during wartime, because during wartime is where there's always pressure on civil liberties during wartime. But you might say, well, why didn't all this happen in other countries? That World War I was a world war. Similar repression happened in other countries, and they didn't invent free speech doctrine of the kind we have in the United States. I don't have an answer to that. I just sort of say, this is where it came from, and it doesn't have to do with anything that makes us sort of culturally different historically than any other part of the world. But nonetheless, it does exist. It's what we expect as a country right now, and it has become part of our present-day tradition.
Maina or Christine, do you want to add?
Just a short thing in terms of that, because I think it's an interesting question about why, and I really have no answer except, but we all thought America was exceptional until last year, until the elections in 2016, and then you join the rest of the world in how you select your leaders. But nevertheless, I think one of the things that strikes me is that the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination was pushed through a lot by African countries and the United States following the Civil Rights Movement. And there is an article there, Article 4, which is very interesting. It says that the state parties shall declare an offense punishable by law or all dissemination of ideas based on racial superiority or hatred, incitement to racial discrimination, as well as all acts of violence and other things like that. And then once it was accepted by all states, the U.S. made reservations against it. So it's one of the things that nobody quite understands. And so its own history, in fact, one of the things about hate speech is that often it's the weaker parts of society that are victims of hate speech. It's interesting, in the U.S. it was a bit of the reverse in a sense that, and so it's those who are weak who are the victims. And I find it fascinating. I mean, as many of us who do human rights work often focus on the rights of the accused, for example, and not on the victims. And I think one of the dilemmas which we have to deal with, and as human rights people, is how do we balance between the rights of victims as we are working on the rights of the accused, and make sure we protect the victims probably more than we protect the accused and those who have suffered for it. So it's an issue of concern. It's still an issue that's going on across the world in terms of debating and deciding and figuring out how do you do this. And I think it's an issue around the groups as opposed to individuals. And again, human rights law is based upon individual rights. But then you start going into this area of hate speech, it becomes community rights or group rights, which are very different in terms of how you understand it and how you deal with it. So it's a bit of an interesting question you've asked. But maybe American exceptionalism doesn't exist anymore.
The only thing I would add is that, it's, as Professor Mack noted, much of free speech doctrine has been developed over the last few decades, but for a very long time, the Supreme Court has been very restrictive of speech rights. So as recently as 1951, the court upheld convictions of individuals who were teaching books by Lenin and Stalin, and that was the only thing that they did. They were convicted and sentenced to extremely long prison sentences for doing that. And so I guess the question is, and maybe I'm reading too much into the questions, is that do we think it's a bad thing that the courts have been more protective of speech? I don't think so, given what we've seen throughout history in wartime, in other times of turmoil. The government has really tried to use its power to censor dissenting views, not just to prohibit them, but also to, obviously with harsh penalties. So.
All right. Yes, sir.
So I will come out as a millennial who's fervently in favor of free speech and thinks that the best way to combat hate speech is through even freer speech. And so this question will kind of touch on some of the concerns that Christine's brought up. But how in crafting a hate speech law or having a hate speech protections against hate speech, how do you prevent groups that are themselves regressive and hateful from taking the ideas in that hate speech prohibition and using them against progress? For instance, you can think of groups that are religious minorities by definition, but they believe in certain things that we would find anathema in the United States, prohibitions against drawing certain figures in cartoons, for instance. How do you deal with those kinds of concerns?
I would say it's really tricky. If not impossible, I think so. Another concern is that the ACLU and other free speech advocates have is that when you create a code of conduct or a law, you're inviting discriminatory enforcement. And in a lawsuit that we had against the University of Michigan over its code of conduct, we found out through discovery, normally student disciplinary records are confidential, but through discovery, we were able to see how the university was enforcing its code of conduct against hate speech. And what we found was that it was disproportionately enforced against black students. And I think that that's what happens, I'm not going to say always, but often what you will find when you create a law or a prohibition is that there will be discriminatory enforcement. And even if you think that government officials aren't going to do it intentionally, we all know that, that there is implicit bias. There's also discriminatory enforcement because privileged folks are more likely to assert their rights. And so that's a real danger of creating more and more regulations on speech, is that you might actually end up harming the communities that you're trying to protect.
If I might just go on that, I think it's a good point you make about the difficulty and the tensions that exist, and probably the one good example is the example of Rwanda from 1994, the genocide, and quite a few commentators have said that hate speech against the Tutsi contributed to the genocide against the Tutsi and moderate Hutus in 1994. Now, so in reaction to that, when the Tutsi government came into place, they put very strong laws that's supposed to prohibit hate speech. But now what's happened is that anybody who says that, for example, nowadays in Rwanda, the language has changed. It's no longer the genocide against the Tutsis and moderate Hutus. It's now only genocide against Tutsi. So if you go say that some Hutus were also killed, they're going to put you to jail. They're going to take you to jail because you're denying genocide. So there's all that kind of stuff. So you're right in the sense that you've got to be careful about where it goes. But on the other question about where a minority group is itself intolerant, then I think that's a difficult issue as well. I think, and for me, the question around all these issues is a tolerance question. And how much are you allowing other groups to feel comfortable within their environment without stepping on their toes? So yes, I appreciate that the United States is very clear about in as much space as you want, and who decides what is good, what's not good, is an issue of concern here. But I think that again, if you look, just going back to the history of hate speech, a lot of that in Europe is the Holocaust in the Second World War and how to protect, because again, you find that in many cases, like these extreme cases, it's often the fact that the one speech that's allowed is the hate speech. The other side of it is not allowed at all. And if you start defending the other side, then you end up in trouble. So it's an interesting conundrum to be in at. But I think the world has moved to the point where there is some regulation. There is a bit more trust, again, of officials of government than there is perhaps here in different ways, and maybe because of the federal system and the way the U.S. is structured. But
if I may, just how do we guard against localism? And let's keep it on the college campus level. I could easily imagine that there would be a different definition of what constitutes hate speech at Berkeley on the one hand or Liberty University on the other. Mm-hmm. Do we need some kind of universal code? Or is that in and of itself so impossible that we're better off allowing free speech even when it occasionally includes hate speech?
I'm going to be a skeptic about universal codes. I tend to think, building on for what Christine was saying, it's very hard to define what should and shouldn't be regulated. There has to be some room for Liberty University to be different than Stanford University. Sometimes there isn't, though. I mean, there also has to be limits. It's not quite in the free speech, or it sort of is, context was religious schools that practiced race discrimination. The big example is Bob Jones University in the early 1980s. And there was this big question, do we allow, there were these private Christian academies that practiced race discrimination, and how much do you discipline them? And this was not a free speech issue. It was actually whether you get a tax exemption from the federal government, but the same kind of issue, right? How much localism should we allow? And, so there are some limits. Sometimes you're going to say we do have to have some kind of a common standard that applies everywhere. But for the most part, I'm an advocate of localism. I think that Liberty University should be different than Stanford University.
I think people at Stanford feel the same way. Your mic is not working again for some reason.
My question's for Ted.
Yeah.
What do you think?
What do I think?
Yeah. I'm going to say.
Would you like to refine that question just a little bit? On the subject of free speech, I'm a free speech advocate. But let me inject a new thought here. As most of you probably know, the internet was originally designed by DARPA at the Pentagon. And the internet was designed specifically so that in the event of a nuclear attack against the United States, there would be a means of communication that was effectively indestructible between military commanders and those political leaders who had survived the initial attack. It may seem like a stretch, but I don't think it's that much of a stretch to suggest that the internet today is equally indestructible when it comes to the interchange of ideas, some of which will be popular, some of which will be unpopular. I'm suggesting that controlling the internet with regard to free speech is impossible, and therefore, for every possible reason I can think of, I'm in favor of free speech, and I might as well come right out and admit it to you. I'm very much in favor of a free exchange of ideas in a university setting. If not here, then where? Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I am also for that, and that is the question. I was born in Islamic world, and I studied Islam with one of the biggest philosophers.
Would you tip the microphone down just a little bit?
Okay.
Yes, there you go.
And, I realize that there can be many questions, but in the Western world, both in Europe and in the US, I have realized that protecting the minority called Muslim become an issue that the minority people like me who wants to question, they never get the chance and they get silenced down. And the student never get the chance to think critically, critical thinking about Islam. And that is a paradox for me, like how much we protecting a minority that result, as the gentleman said, that nobody can say anything about Muhammad, nobody can criticize any Muslim, Islam, and if people who come from the Middle East cannot learn in Stanford and Berkeley and other places to critical thinking, then where they are going to learn critical thinking? They go back to their country and become like, it's not such a good process. What is your take on that?
It's all moved to you. It's all moved to you.
I think it's really, I absolutely agree that universities are a place where there should be an exchange of ideas, that people need to be able to speak freely, obviously within limits so that it doesn't constitute harassment. As someone that works for the ACLU that's deeply committed to speech rights and also to equal protection and ensuring that vulnerable communities have equal educational opportunity, it's hard. It's a tough line to draw, like, because as you said, like we're at a certain point as a minority, how much relentless attack do you have to take on? But I will say, I'll just say personally, I find it a bit troubling that there seems to be this instinct to censor controversial speakers, hateful speakers. I'm not even going to say they're controversial speakers that are presenting genocidal views on campus, or that there are professors that are being investigated for saying things that might constitute a hate speech. I think it's really troubling, and I think. Like Professor Mack mentioned, there are many ways to address students feeling comfortable on campus. And, at the ACLU, when we approach these issues, it's not just, well, it's a marketplace of ideas, you've got to let people speak, and that's where the truth will come out. It's no, we really, as advocates, encourage, press for in lawsuits that there be affirmative steps taken by institutions to ensure that folks feel welcome. It might be trainings. It might be the university using its bully pulpit to say we welcome all students. There's all sorts of things that can be done that is not just about censoring speech. I will say, just relatedly, that you all know your neighbors to the north, UC Berkeley, there has been a lot of controversy around so-called Free Speech Week being allowed, threats by the Trump administration to withdraw funding because the university was, supposedly censoring speech, et cetera. I will say that what I have seen is that the extreme right wing are using censorship or perceived censorship as a way to make themselves be martyrs to some sort of progressive liberal state, and that we can't allow them to take the mantle of free speech when they're espousing racist genocidal views, but when there is a push by students or faculty or members of the public to say, don't allow Milo Yiannopoulos to come to campus, he then can go around saying, I just want to assert my free speech rights, and it obscures the actual nature of his views. So I agree with you that universities obviously have to be a place where there is an exchange of ideas.
Critical thinking, yeah.
Right.
Go ahead, sir.
Hi, everybody. So if there's anything like a consensus here, it seems to be that regulation of hate speech is difficult, and finding workable standards is incredibly difficult. But I find myself here on campus and in life in general struggling with why regulation has to be the answer. And this kind of goes to what you just said. A lot of the time, hateful speech or intentionally sort of cruel and malicious speech arises in interpersonal situations where I find myself bewildered that, people I'm interacting with didn't learn better on the playground, or don't feel that there's sort of like a personal capital that they're expending on being assholes. My question for all of you is sort of about the other side of regulation, the other side of that coin. Are there effective ways to affect normative change, to make people want to not be cruel to one another? Are there success stories on local, state, national scales of cultural shift away from interpersonal cruelty for the sake of speech towards not wanting to, draw the Prophet Muhammad having sex with a goat because you don't think that that's a productive thing to do. You don't think that it's productive to hurt people that way. So that's my question, and I'll take it off the air.
All right, sure. Now you all look in my direction, or maybe in Ted's direction. I would take the premise of the question to be the place to start, where a lot of these controversies are deeply personal. So it's not sort of, okay, is some speaker going to be allowed on campus? Is that there are all these interactions that happen that people experience as hurtful. And the question would be, what do you do about that? And I think the place to start is actually in the personal, and I think there's lots of things that universities and university administrations can do to promote productive personal interaction. So just to give you one example, and I'm going to try to be brief, I teach this class called Critical Race Theory. And critical race theorists have, criticized protection of hate speech. But last time I taught it at Harvard, one of the best papers that was written in my course was written by a woman. I think one of her parents was African American, the other parent was Japanese. She was deeply involved in the Harvard Christian Fellowship. She was very left-wing, and she had all these aspects about her that often weren't seen as going together. And she wrote a paper about her conversations with her fellow members of the Harvard Christian Fellowship and how she used critical race theory to promote productive conversations and how people actually came to understand one another much better. Now, I think that what universities should be doing is promoting those kinds of conversations. They're difficult. There's not a kind of one-size-fits-all solution. But I do think there's lots of stuff that happens in the classrooms, outside the classrooms, where there are just mismatches, misexchanges of information, things that are said, as you said, that are hurtful, but people don't quite realize how hurtful they are and why they're hurtful. And I think that, as I said, some of this conversation always has to be about, a bureaucratic solution, kind of regulating speech. Well, the university should also be trying to promote understanding and promote conversations, and it's hard. It's hard to do. I don't claim to be an expert on it, but I do think that those kinds of conversations are going to be where you're going to start in attacking the kinds of problems that you described.
Can I?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Just a quick thing on that, because I think it's an interesting concept, the question that you asked about. And for me, the basic thing is about values and what is the bottom line of our value system, and how much of that are we going to allow? Are we going to allow for a weakening of those values and going below a ceiling or a floor that exists? And I'm reminded, you're talking, I was reminded about the 1980 elections, I think 80 or 90 elections in Algeria, where there was an Islamic group that was contesting. And their slogan was that they're going to run for these elections called FIS. And they were winning in the polls. And they said they win these elections, and this was the last election ever in Algeria. And it was a fascinating case, because they were using the democratic system to pursue a non-democratic agenda. Eventually, they were overthrown, and they were not allowed. There was a coup, and the election didn't happen. But it's an interesting point about how much do you allow freedom when it's going to lead to unfreedoms or non-freedoms. And I think it's a question we have to ask ourselves about what is the lowest. At what point do we say that some things really cannot be challenged because they're the basis of our value system? And when they have, and I feel very strongly about the context where groups as a group, people as an insult to an individual is an insult to an individual. When you go to a group and a group level and you make them feel small, you make them feel uneasy, you make them feel unwelcome at a place of learning like this when you're at the university, I think you've got to ask that question and have the debate around what can the university do to make everybody's life easier and more comfortable in that university. And there's one part of it where the university has a positive role, but maybe there's a question about a negative role as well, to make sure that everybody feels they're welcome in this university and they don't feel that they're constantly being undermined. But the question about the Islamic thing was interesting, and I like that, because through the work I have done, the fact that the group is victimized, or a group is a victimized group, does not mean it is necessarily a democratic group as well. So you can be a group that is victimized, but you're very undemocratic. And I think that's also got to be challenged within that other group as well. And we shouldn't have any fear of questioning the groups that are victimized as well when they're doing non-human rights valued issues or things.
If I could just add a brief point to that. The gentleman who was up here before made sort of joking reference to images of Muhammad having relations with a goat. The issue is not a truly outrageous depiction of Muhammad, but rather that under fundamentalist Islamic rule, you can have no depiction of Muhammad. We have to be careful not to lose sight of what exactly we're talking about. I think you were next. Go ahead.
Thank you. So in the beginning, I think it was given that hate groups on college campuses were on a rise. And I just wanted to see if any of the panelists had examples of hate groups on campuses. And if so, what would you define as a hate group? That's my first question.
Yeah, I mean, I will just say, so having worked at Southern Poverty Law Center, I'm very aware of the tracking that SPLC has done of hate groups, et cetera. It certainly didn't spike because of the Trump administration. In fact, it spiked during the Obama presidency as a backlash to a black person being president. And so I think the hate groups, what is happening is that they're much more prevalent, that they have been emboldened by the Trump administration, by the rhetoric of the campaign, and so I think that they're more active. I don't know, I did not write the opening, so I'm not sure what was meant by hate group on campus, but I would just say hate groups generally certainly have been on the rise in the United States.
Christine?
Yes.
Do you think it would be more accurate to say not necessarily that hate groups are on the rise? I don't know whether they are or not. Mm-hmm. And you're right to attribute it to the Southern Poverty Law Center. But that because of social media, mm-hmm. because of the internet, our awareness of hate groups has clearly grown.
Right. Well, there are two things, right? The white supremacists, long before Trump or even the last decade, they've been able to use the internet as an organizing tool. So sites like Stormfront, et cetera, but they weren't necessarily well known by the general public. They have come to the they've come to the rise. I mean, they've become to the forefront because of events like Charlottesville. So I agree that the internet has helped facilitate those groups, but I'm not sure it's because of necessarily Facebook or Twitter. It's that my perception is that folks feel more emboldened and are aware of the fact that there are these white supremacist internet sites.
Yes, ma'am?
I had another question, actually.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry. My second question would be, you guys talked about localization and laws based on different places with different geographics, et cetera. And I was just wondering how you would approach words that were reclaimed by a certain group and how they were used within their own group to discriminate against their own people. And if these words were only allowed for them to use, or restricted for everyone to use, for example, like the N-word mm-hmm. and other words that other minority groups have reclaimed.
Without looking at you.
I think that this is, there's a bunch of these words. It's the word queer. There are a bunch of words like this that have been reclaimed and repurposed. I think it's all contextual. So my colleague Randall Kennedy wrote a book titled with the title of the N-word, and this was sort of Randy's position that what does that word mean? It means different things in different contexts. I mean, it's one of the things that makes regulation of hate speech so difficult, right? You can think of some uses of that word where we would say it's hate speech, like this is not difficult. You can see many other uses of that word where we'd say it's, really not hate speech. And there's a whole lot of things in the middle. And so what do? I think whatever you do, it has to be sensitive to context, and that words get repurposed. And sometimes we don't know whether it's hate speech or not until we know something about the context.
Perfect example, Kenneth. Those schools that have barred the teaching of Huckleberry Finn mm-hmm. because the N-word is used repeatedly mm-hmm. and appropriately, given the context of the times and the context of the story. That's a clear example where I believe, free speech demands that you let the book be read as it was written, giving proper attention to the context mm-hmm. of the time mm-hmm. And what was intended by the author.
I would agree with that. My only addendum would be that, yes, if my third grader came home and Huckleberry Finn was assigned in school, I would say, I'm not so sure about that. Yeah. But if my high school, my child who's in high school comes home and is reading Huckleberry Finn, I think that, yeah. And, and you would have to teach it in context. You'd have to have the students understand the way that the words are used. But yeah, I think this, hate, what constitute either hate speech or inappropriate speech is very much bound up in context. And Huckleberry Finn is one of our prime examples.
Can I just add, too, though, that context is incredibly important. And just because some groups have reclaimed a word and they might use it freely, it doesn't mean that in other contexts that using that word wouldn't constitute harassment. So I've talked as an ACLU person a lot about how it's difficult to craft a hate speech code, but certainly I don't want to give the impression that we believe that in an educational context or a workplace that it would be fine to use racial slurs in a way that's intended to harass or to demean another person.
Thank you.
This is still on. Great. So the internet has come up a few times now, and I think rightly so, as it has transformed the way that speech is both communicated and received. And with the EU's recent new regulations around hate speech and kind of assigning liability to maybe not the speaker but the platform, I'm curious as to your thoughts on if something like that would even be effective, or if it's, as Ted said, we just can't bother trying to regulate the internet at all. It's just going to happen.
I didn't get the question.
I'm sorry. I may be the only one up here who didn't really understand the thrust of the
Oh, sorry. So with specific regard to the context around the new EU regulations regulating hate speech, yes, on the internet and assigning fines to not necessarily the speaker but the platform, if that's something that might be effective or not.
And let me just interject to say that will have been the last question. So please answer the question, and if you want to take a moment for a closing thought or two, that's where we are. I'm told we're out of time.
I don't have an answer to that question, to be honest, but I just think that, and I just got I think that came out of Canada, which is looking to restore hate speech law on the internet as well. So it seems to be the trend that to try and regulate it in some form. But would the platform, but would punishing the platform as opposed to the speaker be the issue? And I think that's something that we have had a lot of those things around defamation laws with media and newspapers, and whether a newspaper simply reporting is going to be, should it be held liable for the words of somebody else? And I think my sense always that you don't punish the messenger. I think it's better to get the person themselves. That's my personal view. The messenger shouldn't be punished.
Yeah, I guess I just would add that as much as I said that it's dangerous to allow the government to regulate speech, I would have the same concerns about letting Facebook or Twitter, even though they generally have attempted to ban hate speech. We've seen at the ACLU that because there's a lack of transparency about how they're applying their standards, they will censor ACLU press releases because it has a certain word, or because or other types of comments because there's some sort of trigger. And I think it'd be really tricky and troubling to have platforms, to give platforms the power or the incentive or responsibility of trying to regulate speech. That said, of course, there are times where speech crosses over the line to harassment, and that's going to be context-based. And it would be hard for me to say, in all these contexts it constitutes harassment. It is something that has to be decided on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, and I just in terms of closing remarks, I would just, there's a lot of agreement on this panel, although not complete. I would say that, we all seem to agree that context really does matter. It's really hard to come up with workable standards, even for an entire university. And it makes us less willing to engage in kind of traditional regulation in this area And I would say the same thing about regulating a particular internet platform. The nature of the internet, as Ted was just saying, if you regulate one platform, they're just going to invent another. So you've got to sort of think a little bit more deeply about how do we respond to that as a problem. So thank you all for coming.
I would add just one thought. Consider for a moment, as you think about censorship, that the censor is a person whom you despise. Worry about the identity of the censor. And frankly, when I think about that, then I consider the alternative to be preferable. And I agree with what Kenneth said. I think we surprisingly reached essentially a consensus in this panel, which obviously means that we didn't get it right. But I thank you all for coming, and thanks for your attention.